Hello, everyone. So, I am going to talk about autism in relation to ethics, biases, and its impact, and what we can do about it. So, let's first take a look at the Code of Ethics and what ASHA says about them. I have chosen four to highlight. There are many more, but these are the four I thought were most pertinent to this topic. The first one, when I read this, the first thing that came to mind was utilizing interpreters when it's necessary. We want to make sure our clients have full access to the language they're most comfortable with, and that we are actively advocating for the use of interpreters. The next one I want to highlight, while I would hope it is a given that we all know not to discriminate against the basis of sex, gender expression, or identity, sexual orientation, age, religion, culture, disability, etc. It is a helpful reminder that we have a responsibility to these diverse individuals and to provide them and their families with the best care possible. The next one I found interesting because it hadn't really come to my mind before, but that was to not misrepresent research. I remember for those of us who took the autism class, we discussed the background on why everyone thought that vaccines were the cause of autism. All because someone did unethical research, passed it off as real, and then hundreds of people after him misrepresented the truth and ignored any research that was done afterward, disproving that original research. We can do this with deaf and hard of hearing people as well. In terms of research, I'll discuss that a bit more in the later slides. The next one, when reading this one, I thought of interprofessional practice with audiologists and making sure that everyone is providing best practice, referring to appropriate and up to date research, and overall respecting the patient and providing best quality of care. So here I have a case example. It's kind of vague in terms of the description of the client, but the goal is kind of how do we address this ethical problem. So I'll give you a minute to read that, ponder it, and then I'm going to readdress it at the end of the presentation. And you can pause the video to read that. So, diving into some examples of autism, keep in mind we are not here to point fingers, but to create a community where we can learn and grow and be better clinicians and have some self awareness about the language that we use and the things that we practice. So, some things that we have noticed or witnessed in our own department is the use of the term hearing impaired. While this term was once seen as acceptable, the deaf and hard of hearing community have made it clear that this word has negative connotations and implies that there is something wrong or that needs to be fixed about their hearing status, which is not true. Something else that we've heard is the idea that they have a language delay because of a lack of auditory input. And for a while, this was thought to be true. However, research now shows that it is a lack of language. It is language deprivation that is the reason for the delay, or even for the delay, and not the lack of auditory input. And then language that we have also heard and that I have used as well. I've used all these. Is that the child failed their hearing test instead of just describing the hearing levels that they presented with during their hearing test. Some more examples. I won't read all of them, but you can read through them. Expecting someone to lip read when you're communicating with them, not using subtitles, believing that deaf and hard of hearing people should be forced to wear hearing aids or cochlear implants, or that they should be forced to lip read and not use manual language like ASL. Um, the general idea that verbal speech is kind of the superior modality of communication or the only modality that should be acceptable. ignoring deaf or hard of hearing people, kind of this nonchalant language of, oh, never mind, I'll tell you later. Or even using phrases jokingly, such as, what are you, deaf or something? When someone doesn't hear you or doesn't understand what you communicated to them. Or I know I've used this one a lot. Oh my gosh, I am completely deaf after that concert. Um, After you've been in a loud environment for a while and you can't hear or your ears are kind of ringing. So, looking at autism in academics, we all have taken courses on oral rehab, hearing science, etc. And all of these courses are critical to our practice, to knowing interprofessional practice, and working with deaf and hard of hearing people. But they kind of lack content pertaining to the population, deaf and hard of hearing populations, where they're not using auditory verbal communication, where they're using manual communication, like sign language. And so there was an SLP that wrote an article for ASHA that did a nice job of kind of describing what our coursework could look like if it was more inclusive. Some of the examples are looking at general morphosyntax differences of ASL, English, how ASL and Black ASL differ, just like how we learn how English and African American English differ. Looking at preferred terminology, such as hearing levels versus hearing loss. Looking at deaf history, deaf education, the history of deaf education. And Carolyn kind of went over that in her video. And just generally looking at assessment techniques, intervention techniques, goal writing for deaf and hard of hearing people that are using sign language. Um, yeah, developing literacy skills. I know that I'm not really sure where I might start in terms of teaching literacy skills to a deaf or hard of hearing kid who is using sign language as their primary language. So, what does ASHA say in terms of what terminology we should be using? So, I've kind of highlighted three terms that stand out to me on their page when they discuss terminology regarding deaf and hard of hearing populations. And those are atypical hearing, hearing loss, and typical hearing. So the term hearing loss is kind of similar to hearing impaired. And so we need to tread lightly there. And because loss kind of implies that something negative, something to be sad about. And it can be for some individuals. But for deaf people who identify as deaf, it's not a sad thing for them. Asha also made a statement saying that we should avoid the term hearing impaired, like I mentioned, unless you're talking about IDEA as like a disability category, because that is still a category there. Or for like reimbursement purposes or insurance, that term may still be applicable, and you kind of can't avoid using that term because you need to bill insurance somehow. So, what terminology should we be using? How can we do better? Um, so, the main thing is using deaf or hard of hearing instead of like a hearing impaired person, someone with hearing loss. Um, Capital D deaf is someone who is deaf and identifies with the deaf community. Lowercase d deaf is someone who is deaf and does not identify with the with the deaf community. Oftentimes we can kind of fall into the trap of using language that's comfy, things that we're used to, getting into the patterns of using the same language. But we need to be able to break out of those patterns and learn and grow. And this is one of those examples. And we need to make sure that we're not placing a deaf or hard of hearing person's value on whether or not they can use listening and spoken language. Do we want them to have access to robust language? Absolutely. But the use of speech does not make them smarter or more successful or better of a deaf or hard of hearing person. So we need to make sure to have that distinction. Overall, we just want to educate ourselves. The more you know about something, the better decisions you can make. Attend seminars and webinars, listen and actually learn from deaf people, from hard of hearing people in their community, and what their experiences are like about working with audiologists and SLPs, and keep up with research surrounding deaf and hard of hearing populations with assessment, intervention, etc. So, going back to our case example, let's think about what we might say to the family, how we would respond, how we would move forward. So, first, we can observe some Audist language in that case example, both from the audiologist and the friend SLP. One of the things in there is that the audiologist said that implanting cochlear implants will give them access to language. Like I mentioned before, um, access to sound does not mean access to language, and we need to be careful about that. And then the friend SLP used the term hearing impairment, which is something we want to avoid, and that their hearing impairment was what caused the language disorder, which is also not true. The cause of the language disorder, um, not disorder, but cause of a language delay could be to language deprivation, like I mentioned previously. And then we want to use current peer-reviewed research to educate the parents on what we know about intervention for deaf children who are using ASL as their L1, provide lots of information on terminology, um, provide information on cochlear implants, what other families have said about their experience with cochlear implants, maybe connect them to a deaf educator or other families raising deaf children through Washington State Hands and Voices. I've linked their website on the sources page. They're a great resource for connecting families. What we don't want to do is discredit the audiologist. We want to maintain respect and collaboration with them. They are a professional in their field, they know what they're talking about, but we do want to provide them with the research that we are using and that we have found and enter into a respectful dialogue on how to best serve the family without confusing them more, and without creating any animosity between the two professionals. Thank you for listening to all of that. Just a few things. If you're into Instagram, these are some cool people to check out. The Ariel series, it's a family of two deaf parents and one hearing child. We call that a CODA, child of deaf adult, where their primary language is ASL. So this hearing child, their first language is ASL, which is super interesting. They've got tons of videos on it. The next that I really like is Language First. They're an organization that talks about the effects of incomplete L1 acquisition or late L1 acquisition due to language deprivation. So they've got a lot of cool information there, research, guest speakers, all that kind of stuff. And then another person I like is Adventures in Deaf Ed. She talks a lot about autism, ableism, learning and teaching ASL, educating deaf and hard of hearing people. And she's got a lot of great information too. Here's my sources. A couple of these articles I think are in our supplemental sources if you want to save them for later. Down below is Washington State Hands and Voices if you want to check them out. Yeah, thank you very much.